Amber stepped off the military bus, boots touching home soil for the first time in 18 months. Her uniform was neatly pressed, her medals shined under the warm afternoon sun, and her heart beat fast with excitement. Deployment had changed her in many ways, but there was one thing that had kept her going during every grueling mission: the thought of returning home, surprising her mom, and seeing that familiar smile. The street looked mostly the same, but as she approached her childhood home, something felt off. The curtains were different, heavy and floral instead of the soft white ones her mother loved. The mailbox that once bore her and her mother's names now sat bare. The porch, where her old bicycle used to lean and where she'd left a small potted plant before leaving, was empty. Not just cleaned, cleared. Her eyes narrowed as she scanned every detail. The locks looked new. The welcome mat was gone. As she stood frozen on the sidewalk, trying to make sense of it, a voice broke the moment. "Amber." It was Mrs. Ortega, the old woman from across the street. The neighbor's face was a mixture of disbelief and confusion, her watering can slipping slightly from her grasp. Amber offered a weak wave, lips parting to speak, but no words came. She didn't knock. She didn't call out. Instead, she crossed the road slowly, eyes fixed on the window where someone was moving inside the house. A man, older, slightly hunched, his silhouette strangely familiar. And then it clicked. Her grandfather. He was moving through the living room like he owned the place, wearing the same cardigan she remembered from years ago. A box-labeled kitchen sat near the doorway. From where she stood, she could see him humming to himself, placing a photo frame on the mantel, one that used to have her and her mother in it. Amber took a quiet step back, retreating to the shadows across the street. She didn't know what was happening yet, but one thing was clear. Something was deeply wrong. And whatever it was, it had started in her absence. While she was out fighting a war, another one had crept into her own home. Across the street, Amber stood frozen in place, watching the man who now moved comfortably in her mother's home. The sting of confusion burned beneath her skin, but with it came a flood of memory, the missing weeks that no one back home had ever truly known about. It had happened deep in the desert. Her unit was ambushed during a late-night patrol. 1 second, she was checking the terrain through a dusty scope. The next, she was knocked unconscious by the blast of an IED. When she came to, her helmet was cracked, her arm dislocated, and her gear, including her identification, radio, and phone, had been destroyed. She was stranded in the open. No signal, no name tag, just blood, dust, and the hope someone would find her before the enemy did. After 2 harrowing days of crawling and hiding, a search team recovered her, barely alive, and transported her to a secure Allied base. There, she spent the next month in a medical facility under classified hold. Because of the attack's sensitivity and location, communication was delayed. By the time the military updated its internal files, weeks had passed. She had assumed her family would be notified eventually. She'd written letters, but they were delayed. She recorded voice messages that never left the system. In her mind, she'd return home, explain everything, and laugh about how the army's red tape nearly declared her a ghost. But that ghost had already been buried by someone she trusted. While she was healing behind guarded fences, her grandfather had acted fast. Using the time gap between her last known contact and the military's silence, he went to a lawyer and declared her dead. With no immediate correction from official sources, his story held. He used her mother's fragile health and Amber's sacrifice as a manipulative cloak. Neighbors wept for him. The community sent flowers. He crafted a narrative. His granddaughter, the brave soldier, gone in service. And now, with no father in the picture and a mother barely responsive, he would carry on her legacy. And take the house. Amber never saw it coming. She had fought through sandstorms, through injury and terror, only to return to find she'd been erased from her own life, her own home, her own bloodline. As she stood there, watching him sip tea from her mother's favorite mug, one thought pulsed in her mind like a war drum. He declared me dead, but I'm here, and I remember everything. While Amber's blood still ran warm in distant sand, her grandfather was orchestrating a masterpiece of deception. It began quietly, A hushed visit to the local records office, just days after the military listed Amber as unreachable. Her grandfather, always a man who knew someone, leaned on an old connection in city administration. With forged paperwork, a trembling hand, and just the right amount of visible grief, he submitted a false death certificate. No one questioned the elderly man with watery eyes and a shaking voice who claimed to be handling the affairs of his fallen granddaughter. From there, the lie grew legs. He visited a family lawyer who had once handled their will. With her military status and no spouse or children to complicate things, the claim was simple. He was Amber's only next of kin. He brought printed emails with fake condolences from non-existent commanders. He played the role of grieving guardian with astonishing skill. Even wore one of Amber's old military pins on his lapel, which he claimed was the last thing she touched. The lawyer, relying on the documentation, saw no red flags. Probate was fast-tracked. The home, once shared by Amber and her mother, was now legally his, at least on paper. Then came the clearing out. He sold Amber's car to a mechanic for half its value, citing too many painful memories. Her dog, a golden retriever named Dusty who waited by the front door every evening for months, was given away to a neighbor who could love him without crying. He didn't shed a single tear himself. Amber's medals, her commendation for valor, her deployment badges, even her basic training graduation coin, were all dumped into a cardboard box and delivered to a local donation center. He kept none of it, not even a photo. And then came the final move. The deed to the house was changed. Forged signatures, notarized by a crooked friend at a local title agency. A new name on the mailbox. A new alarm system. A fresh coat of paint on the shutters, not out of respect, but to prepare it for the market. The truth was, her grandfather didn't need the house. He didn't even want to live in it. The property sat on valuable land, and flipping it meant profit, big profit. But with Amber's mother bedridden and unaware, he had a window to strike. He planned to sell it quietly, move the mother to a care facility, and disappear with the money. But there was one problem with his plan. Amber wasn't dead, and she had just come home. Amber stood across the street, motionless in her uniform, watching the man who had buried her with paperwork and lies. To the world, she was a ghost, not by tragedy, but by design. The house she'd grown up in was now a stranger's fortress. Her name had been scrubbed, her belongings scattered, her existence rewritten. She didn't cry. She didn't knock. She turned and walked away. She went to the one place where truth couldn't be buried so easily, the local police station. The moment she stepped inside, a wave of familiarity clashed with disbelief. Desks, buzzing phones, half-finished reports, all faded into the background when a familiar voice said, "Can I help?" then stopped mid-sentence. Officer Thompson stood behind the counter, coffee in hand. The mug slipped slightly in his grip before he caught it. His eyes widened. "Amber," he whispered, blinking as though his own eyes were playing tricks. She nodded. "I need help." They moved quickly to the back, where her voice dropped into low, steady tones. She explained everything: her deployment, the ambush, the recovery, and her arrival back home. Thompson, still reeling, began typing into the database. It took less than a minute to confirm his suspicion. According to state and federal systems, Amber Lynn Hayes had died nearly 10 months ago. Her death certificate was on file. Her records marked finalized. Her military status listed deceased in action. A flag had even been ordered on her behalf, sent, apparently, to the wrong address. Thompson leaned back in his chair, visibly rattled. This isn't a mistake, Amber. This was intentional. Someone did this to you." Amber clenched her jaw. "I know who." He pulled up logs of property transfers, probate documents, and state ID activity. Everything pointed to her grandfather. The timeline was neat, too neat. He had filed each legal motion just days after her disappearance had made local news. He hadn't waited for updates, hadn't requested confirmation from military. He knew she was alive, and still moved forward, betting on the silence of bureaucracy. Why didn't anyone challenge it? Amber asked. Thompson looked at her with reluctant honesty. Because no one had a reason to. You had no spouse, no kids, and your mother, well, she wasn't in any condition to object. He was the only one who claimed you. And now, legally, you don't exist. Amber's eyes didn't blink. Her fist didn't tremble. She simply nodded. He wanted me gone, she said, voice low. Now he'll see what happens when ghosts come back to life. And with that, the wheels of truth began to turn. Quietly, swiftly. Amber was no longer just a soldier. She was a ghost with unfinished business. Amber left the station with more than just a pulse. She left with a mission. Her body had survived combat, but now her identity needed rescuing. The police, stunned yet resolute, agreed. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It was deliberate, orchestrated fraud. But to bring her grandfather down legally, they needed proof, not just that she was alive, but that he was still actively deceiving the system. A sting was set into motion. Officer Thompson coordinated with the district attorney's office to prepare emergency filings. Amber's status had to be corrected through military channels, but that would take a few days. What they needed now was evidence of ongoing fraud. That meant catching her grandfather in the act. Amber was warned not to confront him. Not yet. A single emotional outburst could jeopardize everything. No warnings. No confrontations. Just watch. Wait. Document. Over the next 24 hours, Amber became her own investigator. She returned to the neighborhood under the cover of early morning fog. A hoodie over her uniform, she moved with precision, the way she had during recon missions overseas. Her first stop, the mailbox. The brass letters that once spelled Hayes had been scratched off, violently. The metal still bore the scrape marks. In their place was a cheap plastic sticker, E. Hayes. Her grandfather's name. She snapped a photo. Behind the trash bin sat a cracked storage box, one she recognized instantly. She lifted the lid and nearly choked. Inside were her high school journals, her basic training notebook, her medals ribbon, and, soaked from the rain, the family photo they once kept in the hallway. Her face had been cut out. Click. Another photo. She circled to the side yard. Her old uniform boots were sitting in a donation pile. Her name tag had been ripped off. This wasn't just theft. This was erasure. Amber knelt behind the hedge, her phone trembling slightly in her grip. Her heartbeat slowed, not from fear, but grief, the kind that went deeper than war wounds. This man hadn't just taken her property. He'd taken her presence, her place in the family, in the world. She remembered the way her grandfather used to read her bedtime stories. The warm bowl of jollof rice he'd serve when her mom was too tired. The moments that made her believe he cared. Now, she saw it for what it was, performance. Because when power knocked, he didn't just answer. He rewrote the story. That evening, Officer Thompson called. Judge approved the emergency warrant. We're moving in tomorrow. Be ready. Amber's voice was steady. I've been ready since the day he buried me alive. And for the first time in months, the truth had a timeline. The sun hadn't risen yet. The sky hung heavy with pre-dawn gray as Amber stood silently at the foot of the driveway, her boots planted firmly on the concrete path that once led her home. No hoodie this time. No shadows to hide in. She wore her full military uniform. Crisp, polished, proud. The medals on her chest gleamed faintly under the streetlight, like scars she now wore with purpose. The neighborhood was still asleep, unaware that justice was moments away from arriving. Then, the front door creaked open. Her grandfather shuffled out, bathrobe cinched lazily at the waist, slippers scuffing the tiled porch. He bent down, groaning, to retrieve the newspaper. But halfway up, his eyes caught hers. He froze. For a second, he didn't move. His hand trembled around the rolled-up paper. Then slowly, his expression morphed, from disbelief to calculation to that old familiar mask, the smile. Amber, he said softly, forcing warmth into his voice. You're back. Her face didn't change. Not a blink. Not a twitch. His eyes darted around, as if checking for cameras, for neighbors, for a hidden setup. You weren't supposed to come back, he muttered, his voice lower now. The smile cracked. I made peace with your memory. We all did. Still, she said nothing. The silence was louder than any accusation. He took a step forward, but something about her posture held him back, something unbreakable. She stood like a statue of consequence, carved by truth and fire. Look, we can talk, he tried again. The house, it was never about greed. It was for your mother. She needed care. I had to make choices, hard ones. You weren't here. Amber's gaze didn't shift. Her fists remained at her side. She didn't argue. She didn't scream. Her silence screamed enough. And then, the moment arrived. Two unmarked police vehicles glided into view from either end of the street, moving slowly, deliberately. One pulled into the driveway behind her. The other stopped near the curb. Doors opened. Officer Thompson stepped out, his badge already visible. Her grandfather turned to run, but didn't take a single step. Because Amber finally moved. She didn't touch him. She didn't block his path. She simply took one step forward, just one, and looked him straight in the eye. He understood. Thompson approached from behind, voice calm but cold. Edward Hayes, you are under arrest for fraud, identity theft, falsifying government records, and unlawful seizure of property. As the cuffs clicked behind his back, Amber watched. Her grandfather didn't fight. He looked at her one last time, searching for mercy, perhaps. But all he saw was the truth. Standing tall, wearing a uniform, refusing to disappear. And for once, he had nothing to say. The morning bloomed with quiet tension as Officer Thompson handed over the search warrant at the front door. Amber stood behind him, calm but alert, her boots on the steps she hadn't touched in over a year. The porch creaked beneath the weight of consequence. Her grandfather stood motionless, lips pressed into a thin line. This is ridiculous, he muttered, but stepped aside when Thompson's team entered. The officers fanned out across the house like a practiced unit, scanning, recording, collecting. Amber remained in the entryway, her eyes drifting across the familiar yet unfamiliar walls. The scent of old furniture and lemon cleaner was still there, but something had shifted. The warmth was gone. The house felt staged, like a set built on the bones of a past. Thompson opened the first drawer in the study and found exactly what they hoped for. There it was, the forged death certificate. Printed, stamped, notarized by a name already under internal investigation. Next to it, a copy of a legal affidavit claiming Edward Hayes as Amber's sole heir. Further down the drawer, a folder of bank statements. Large transfers had been made from her mother's joint account into a separate one Amber had never known existed. That account had then wired money into a private escrow to prepare the house for sale. Amber's throat tightened as she watched them uncover each lie like peeling the skin off a rotten fruit. Her grandfather paced near the kitchen, now growing visibly nervous. Listen, he said, voice louder now, you don't know what it was like. She was gone. No calls, no letters. And Mary, she was falling apart. I had to take care of things. Thompson didn't stop flipping through folders. Taking care of things doesn't include falsifying a federal death record. She was dead to us, he snapped, eyes flicking toward Amber. What was I supposed to think? Amber still didn't speak. She just stayed at the photo frame sitting above the fireplace. It drew her in. Framed in cheap black wood was a newspaper clipping. Local hero dies in combat. A community mourns. Her name was bolded, her picture centered. The obituary had been printed and framed. Amber stepped forward and gently took it off the mantel. The room fell quiet. Care to explain this? Thompson asked. Her grandfather opened his mouth, but nothing came out. His lies had caught up to him. The obituary wasn't just proof of fraud. It was intentional fiction. Crafted, framed, displayed. Not even grief could excuse that. Thompson turned toward the other officer. That's enough. We have everything. They began sealing evidence bags as her grandfather slumped into the armchair, deflated and pale. No one needed to yell. No one needed to argue. The walls of his deception had collapsed under the weight of truth. Amber stood tall. The home she once lost was still scarred, but the truth had returned, and it was wearing a badge. The courtroom was quiet, almost too quiet, as Amber took the stand. Her uniform was pressed. Her voice, steady. The judge, attorneys, jury, all eyes were on her as she spoke not of combat or enemy fire, but of betrayal that wore a familiar face. "I didn't die overseas," she said clearly, hands folded in front of her. "But someone made sure the world believed I did." She recounted the ambush, the silence that followed, and the recovery in a secure location. But more than that, she painted a picture of what it meant to come home and find yourself erased. Next came the neighbor, Mrs. Ortega. Wrinkled hands clutching a worn leather purse, she walked slowly to the witness stand. Her voice trembled as she recalled how Edward Hayes celebrated after receiving the house keys. "He said it was bittersweet," she whispered. "But I remember him smiling, laughing even. Said, she gave her life for this country, and now I'll give the house a new one." He made it sound noble, but something about it felt wrong. There was a pause. Then the judge opened a sealed letter, handwritten and shaky, but clear. Amber's mother had composed it from her assisted living bed, her fingers weak but her memory unclouded. "My father," the letter read, "used my grief and confusion to control everything. He told me Amber was gone and that it was best not to talk about it. I trusted him. I believed him. But now I see. He gaslighted me. He buried my daughter while she was still alive." Gasps murmured through the gallery. The jury leaned forward. Military officials were called in next. They confirmed Amber's service, her commendations, and the bureaucratic delay in correcting her MIA status. The courtroom was shown a side-by-side of her real-time location logs and the timeline of her grandfather's filings. The overlap was damning. Then came the moment of restoration. The judge addressed the court. "We recognize and reinstate Amber Lynn Hayes as a living citizen of the United States with full legal status and rights effective immediately." Amber closed her eyes for half a second. The weight she'd carried since returning home began to lift. But the consequences were far from over. The court ordered an immediate freeze on the house sale. All assets tied to the fraudulent transfer were locked pending further investigation. The property was returned to Amber and her mother. Her grandfather sat silently at the defense table, the color drained from his face. The charges read aloud were sharp and clear. Felony fraud, falsifying government documents, impersonation of next of kin, elder abuse. He said nothing as the cuffs were placed back on, not even when the judge denied bail. Amber didn't look at him as he was escorted out. She had already mourned who he used to be. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming what was hers. Her name, her home, her truth. The house felt unfamiliar at first. The floors creaked the same. The light filtered through the windows just as it had when she was a child. But the warmth had to be rebuilt. Amber stepped through the front door with a quiet kind of reverence, her boots echoing softly across the entryway. No fanfare, no dramatic reunion. Just her, the dust, and the silence that lingered where lies had once lived. Room by room, she walked through the home like a soldier returning to an old battlefield. The curtains her grandfather had hung were taken down first. Then the framed obituary, quietly removed, the glass set aside, the paper burned. She opened closets, peered under furniture, and finally, in the attic corner, she found a small rusted tin. Inside, her father's dog tags. They were wrapped in a piece of cloth, tucked beside a faded photograph, her as a baby in her father's arms, his uniform clean, his smile youthful. She sat on the floor and held the tags to her chest. The tears came slowly, not from pain, but from something deeper, restoration. He would have been proud of the soldier she became, of the fight she chose, of the way she came back not to retaliate, but to reclaim. Outside, the mailbox still bore the plastic E. Hayes lettering, a final scar. Amber grabbed a screwdriver and peeled it off. With fresh paint and stencils, she carefully restored the name that was meant to be there all along, A.L. Hayes. It gleamed in the sunlight, bold, permanent, true. Over the following days, a kind lawyer from the district's Veteran Affairs office helped her track down items her grandfather had donated or sold. Some were already gone, but others, her boot knife, a framed photo collage, a university sweatshirt, found their way home. When Amber wheeled her mother through the front door, she wasn't sure what to expect. Her mother, frail but alert, looked around with slow, watery eyes. Her hand found Amber's. "You brought us home," she whispered, voice thin but steady. Amber leaned down and kissed her forehead. No one's taking it from us again. Later that week, while sorting papers at the kitchen table, she came across a journal her father had once kept. Scribbled in the margins was an idea he'd written just months before deployment, a dream to start a support program for homeless veterans. She smiled. That night, Amber registered the Hayes Honor Fund, a charitable trust in her father's name, dedicated to helping veterans facing housing instability. It was her way of rewriting legacy, not with lies, but with purpose. The house still needed repairs. The walls still whispered. But step by step, truth was scrubbing the past clean. Amber wasn't just rebuilding a home. She was restoring a future, one room, one name, one life at a time. 1 year later, the air felt different. Not lighter, but cleaner, like a storm had passed and left behind a clearer sky. Amber stood tall at the front of a modest auditorium in her old town's public school, her dress uniform crisp, her medals neatly aligned. Rows of young women, high schoolers with bright eyes and notebooks in their laps, looked up at her in rapt attention. She wasn't here as a soldier today. She was here as a survivor. As she shared her story, there was no bitterness in her voice, only steady resolve. She told them about combat, about being left behind, about crawling through sand with no ID and no voice. But more importantly, she told them what happened when she came home and found herself declared dead, her home stolen, her identity stripped by someone she once trusted. They thought silence would protect them, she said softly. But truth doesn't die just because no one wants to hear it. A few girls wiped their eyes. One raised a hand and asked, "Weren't you angry?" Amber smiled gently. "Yes, but I didn't use it to destroy. I used it to rebuild." That night, she returned to the house. Hayes, legally and rightfully. The repairs were complete. The roof was solid, the paint fresh, and the porch light no longer flickered. But it wasn't just the structure that had changed. It was the spirit inside. It was once again a place of dignity, a place her father would have been proud of. In the hallway, just above a side table where she now kept a folded American flag, she hung a small bronze plaque. Simple, unadorned, but powerful. Truth may walk slowly, but it always arrives. She touched it briefly with her fingertips, then stepped back to admire it. In that house, lies had taken root, but truth had marched in and reclaimed every room. Her grandfather was now serving a multi-year sentence. The trial had made local news. Veteran declared dead by grandfather in fraud scheme. There had been no apology, no remorse. But Amber no longer needed that. She had what mattered: her name, her home, her mother's quiet smile each morning, and her own peace. The Hayes Honor Fund had already helped 3 veterans find stable housing. And her next plan, a community center named after her late father, was underway. Amber stood by the front door that night, watching the wind stir the trees outside. She reached for the latch, then paused, as if remembering something long buried. And then she whispered, as much to herself as to the ghosts of the past, "He tried to bury me with lies, but I returned in truth," and marched straight through the door he tried to lock.